You don't need to understand the deal, Adrian Cole said, his voice smooth and dismissive. Just bring the wine. The words didn't echo. They sliced, clean and precise, across a room built on silence and money. Conversations paused. Not stopped, just softened, like people instinctively knew something had shifted. Naomi Brooks stood there, bottle tilted mid-pour, the deep red liquid catching the amber light before settling into crystal. Her hand didn't shake. It never did. Around her, the private dining room shimmered with quiet power, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking downtown, a skyline glowing like a promise only a few could afford, polished marble reflecting every flicker of candlelight, every glance, every judgment. At the center of it all sat Adrian Cole, 39, founder of Cole Ventures, a man whose name alone could move markets by Monday morning. His suit was tailored within an inch of perfection, his watch understated, but worth more than most annual salaries, his presence calibrated to dominate without ever needing to raise his voice. He didn't look at Naomi when he spoke. He didn't need to. To him, she was part of the setting, like the glassware or the view, necessary, but not worth focus. And that was how he preferred the world, organized, predictable, ranked. Across the table, investors leaned in, nodding along as numbers floated between them. 200 million here, projected returns there, language wrapped in confidence and assumption. No one questioned him. They rarely did. Naomi finished pouring and stepped back, silent, invisible again. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Because what no one in that room noticed, what no one ever noticed, was how closely she listened. Not casually, not out of curiosity, but with precision. Her eyes moved once, briefly, toward the tablet resting beside Adrian's hand, the contract displayed in clean digital lines, numbers and clauses scrolling past like they belonged only to people who wore suits like his. She looked away just as quickly. Years of practice had taught her that being seen looking was more dangerous than not seeing at all. Naomi Brooks, 27, had mastered the art of presence without attention. 2 jobs, night shifts, a small apartment 40 minutes away by bus, a younger brother waiting at home with textbooks she refused to let him give up on. People saw the uniform. They didn't see the discipline it took to hold yourself together when the world insisted you were background. Adrian leaned back slightly, a faint smile touching his lips as one of the partners laughed a little too loudly at something he'd said. Control. That was his currency. Control of the room, of the deal, of the narrative. He reached for his glass, pausing just long enough to glance, finally, at Naomi. Not really at her. Through her. You ever seen numbers like this before? He asked, almost amused. A few heads turned. Not because they expected an answer, but because they already knew what it would be. Silence. That was the role she was supposed to play. Naomi met his gaze for exactly 1 second. Not defiant. Not submissive. Just steady. Then she lowered her eyes again, as if confirming exactly what he believed about her. And that's when it happened. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a shift. A realization forming quietly behind her calm expression, like a door opening in a place no one else thought to look. Because in that room full of power, confidence, and certainty, there was something wrong. And she was the only one who saw it. The room did not move, but something inside it tightened, like the air had learned to listen. Adrian kept talking, his voice calm, measured, confident, outlining projections and timelines as if nothing in the world could interrupt his momentum. Numbers rolled off his tongue like certainty. 8 quarters of growth. A projected return north of 30%. A structure designed to minimize risk and maximize control. The kind of language that made investors lean in and nod. The kind that made deals feel inevitable before they were even signed. Naomi stood 2 steps behind his chair now, tray balanced against her palm, her posture quiet and precise. To anyone watching, she was exactly what they expected. Still, invisible, replaceable. But her mind was not where her body was. It was back on that screen. Section numbers. Legal phrasing. A clause that did not sit right. She had only seen it for a second, maybe less, but it stayed. The wording was off. Not wrong enough to alarm someone moving fast, but wrong enough to matter if you knew where to look. And Naomi knew how to look. Not because she was supposed to, but because she had spent years learning things no one expected her to learn. Late nights after double shifts, sitting at a small kitchen table with a borrowed laptop, reading through contracts, watching lectures, teaching herself how systems worked, how language shaped power, how one misplaced line could change everything. No one in that room knew that. They did not ask. Adrian gestured toward the tablet again, sliding it slightly toward one of the partners. Everything has been reviewed, he said, his tone carrying quiet authority. We are clean. Clean. The word landed heavier than it should have. Naomi's eyes flicked once more, fast enough to be nothing, slow enough to confirm what she felt. That clause again. Section 8.3. It referenced a compliance framework that did not apply in California. Not for this type of deal. Not under these conditions. It was subtle, easy to overlook. But if signed, it could invalidate the agreement or worse, expose them to liability no one in that room was prepared for. She felt it then. That internal pull. The one that asked a dangerous question. Say something. Her grip tightened slightly on the tray. She knew the rules. Do not interrupt. Do not correct. Do not step outside your place. Especially not here. Especially not in front of men who built their identities on being right. Adrian continued, already moving toward the close, the part where confidence turns into signatures and signatures turn into headlines. One of the investors nodded, reaching for his pen. Another leaned forward, ready to finalize numbers that had been floating in conversation all night. Momentum was building. Fast. Too fast. Naomi inhaled quietly, the kind of breath that does not show but changes everything. Because sometimes the difference between staying invisible and becoming visible is one decision. One moment. One sentence. She looked at Adrian again. This time not through him. At him. And for the first time that night, she did not lower her gaze. Wait. The word did not come out loud, but it landed with weight, just enough to interrupt the rhythm of confidence that had been building all night. Adrian's hand paused midair, the pen hovering just above the contract on his tablet, not because he was told to stop, but because something in the room had shifted again. He looked up, not expecting to find anything worth noticing, and for the first time, his eyes actually met Naomi's. Not through her, not past her, at her. There was no defiance in her expression, no urgency, no performance, just certainty, the kind that does not ask for permission. You might want to take another look at section 8.3, she said, her voice even, measured, almost quiet enough to ignore. Almost. One of the investors frowned slightly, leaning forward. Section 8.3? He repeated, as if saying it out loud might make sense. Adrian's expression tightened just a fraction, the kind of micro shift only someone paying close attention would notice. He did not like being interrupted. Especially not like this. Especially not by someone he had already decided did not belong in the conversation. We have already reviewed everything, he replied, his tone controlled, but colder now. A warning wrapped in politeness. Naomi did not move. Then you already know it references a compliance structure that does not apply in this state, she said, just as calmly. No accusation. No edge. Just fact. Silence followed, but this time it was different. It was not polite silence. It was thinking silence. The kind that spreads fast and pulls attention with it. The investor closest to Adrian reached for the tablet without asking, scrolling quickly, eyes narrowing as he found the clause. Seconds passed. Then more. She is right, he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier confidence. Another partner leaned in. That would invalidate the protection on liability, he added, his tone sharper, more alert. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. Adrian felt it. Control did not leave all at once. It slipped. Quietly. The way it always does when certainty cracks. He took the tablet back, scanning the section himself now, slower this time, more deliberate. The words were the same. They had always been the same. But now they read differently. Now they carried consequence. Naomi stood exactly where she had been, tray still balanced, posture unchanged, as if she had not just altered the direction of a $200 million deal with a single sentence. No one was looking at the skyline anymore. No one was checking their watch. Every eye in that room had shifted, recalibrating, trying to understand how the least important person in the room had just become the most relevant. Adrian looked up again, really looked this time, searching for something he could categorize, something that would put her back in the box he preferred. But there was nothing to grab onto. No arrogance. No hesitation. Just quiet confidence that did not need validation. And that was the problem. Because for the first time that night, Adrian Cole was not the one controlling the room. And everyone could feel it. Adrian did not speak right away, and that alone was enough to unsettle the room. He had built an empire on immediate answers, sharp reactions, decisive moves. Silence was not his language. Not like this. He scrolled again, slower now, reading every word of the clause as if it might rearrange itself under pressure. It did not. The mistake was still there. Quiet. Precise. Expensive. One of the investors cleared his throat softly, the kind of sound people make when they're trying to stay neutral but already know the balance has shifted. How did we miss that? He asked, not accusing, just surprised. Adrian did not answer. He was not used to being on the receiving end of that question. Across the table, another partner leaned back, arms folding, studying Naomi with a different kind of attention now. Not the passing glance given to staff, but the focused curiosity reserved for someone who had just proven they understood the game. Naomi did not react to any of it. She simply stood there, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had only done what was necessary and nothing more. No pride, no tension, just presence. Adrian finally looked up again, his gaze sharper this time, measuring. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked, the edge in his voice no longer dismissive, but searching. It was not a compliment. It was a recalibration. Naomi met his eyes again, steady as before. "Same way anyone does," she replied quietly. "By paying attention." A few people exchanged glances. The answer was simple, but it landed heavier than anything complicated could have. Because it was not about access. It was about awareness. Adrian leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, his mind moving faster now, retracing steps, recalculating risk, adjusting in real time. This was what he did best. Adapt. Regain control. But something about this situation resisted that instinct. Because control depends on knowing where everyone stands. And for the first time that night, he did not know where she stood. The tablet rested between them, no longer a symbol of certainty, but of exposure. The deal was not dead, but it was no longer clean. And everyone in the room knew it. One of the partners spoke again, more cautiously now. "We will need to revise that section before moving forward." Another nodded. Agreed. Momentum had slowed. Not stopped, but redirected. And it had not been redirected by strategy, or negotiation, or power. It had been redirected by a voice no one expected to hear. Adrian exhaled quietly, not frustrated, not defeated, but aware. A rare state for a man like him. He looked at Naomi once more, this time without assumption, without dismissal, just observation, trying to understand what he had overlooked. And more importantly, why? Because it was not just the mistake in the contract that unsettled him. It was the realization that the only person who caught it had been standing in the room the entire time. Unseen, unheard, until she chose not to be. No one reached for their glass anymore. The room, once flowing with quiet confidence, now held still like it was waiting for permission to breathe again. Adrian tapped the edge of the tablet once, a small, controlled movement, but enough to reset the rhythm. "We adjust the clause," he said, voice steady, reclaiming structure. "We proceed." It sounded decisive. It sounded like control. And for a moment, it almost worked. One of the partners nodded, relieved to move forward. Another leaned in again, pen returning to hand, ready to close what had nearly slipped. But Naomi did not step away. Not yet. That was the part no one expected. She was supposed to return to the background now, to let the correction be enough, to disappear back into silence like she had never spoken. That was the unspoken agreement of rooms like this. You disrupt only once. You do not linger. You do not push further. Naomi remained where she was, tray still balanced, eyes calm, mind still working. Because the clause had not been the only thing that felt wrong. It was just the first thing she could prove. Adrian noticed it immediately. The way she had not moved. The way her presence did not shrink after being acknowledged. His gaze sharpened again, curiosity mixing with something else now. Caution. Something else, he asked, not loudly, but directly. It was not an invitation. It was a test. Naomi took a small breath. Measured, deliberate. "The timeline," she said. A few brows furrowed. Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Be specific." Naomi nodded once. "You are projecting integration in 6 months," she continued, her voice still even, still controlled. but your compliance adjustment alone will delay approval by at least 90 days. That pushes your rollout into the next fiscal window. A pause. Not long. Just long enough. Which means your projected return for the first year is overstated. The words landed differently this time. Heavier. Not because they were louder, but because they connected. One correction could be dismissed as sharp observation. Two became a pattern. The investor across from Adrian leaned back slowly, pin lowering again. Is that accurate? He asked, looking at Adrian now, not Naomi. That was the shift. Adrian felt it. The subtle transfer of attention, of trust. He ran the numbers quickly in his head, faster than anyone else in the room could follow, adjusting variables, recalculating assumptions. And there it was. Not wrong, but not clean, not precise, not the way he had presented it. His jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. Naomi had not just pointed out a mistake. She had exposed an overreach. And in rooms like this, precision was everything. Overconfidence had a cost. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was evaluative. The kind of silence where decisions start forming beneath the surface. Naomi did not fill it. She did not explain further. She had said enough. More than enough. Adrian placed the tablet flat on the table this time, no longer holding it like a shield, but letting it sit between them as something to be examined. We revised the projections, he said finally, his voice quieter now, but clearer. Not defensive, not dismissive, just adjusted. And that was the second shift. Because power had not left him, but it had changed shape. And for the first time that night, Adrian Cole was no longer the only one defining the terms of the conversation. Adrian did not rush to speak this time, and that hesitation carried more weight than any command he had given earlier that night. The room adjusted around it, investors sitting straighter, attention narrowing, recalculations happening behind composed expressions. Momentum had shifted, but it had not collapsed. It was being rewritten in real time. Adrian's fingers rested lightly against the table, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience. Instead, they were still, as if even he understood that moving too quickly now would expose more than it would fix. He looked at Naomi again, not with disbelief, not with irritation, but with something far more unfamiliar. Consideration. You are suggesting the entire first-year projection is misaligned, he said, his voice measured, controlled, but no longer dismissive. Naomi nodded once, calm, grounded. Not misaligned, she replied softly. Optimistic beyond what the structure supports. A subtle difference. But in rooms like this, language was everything. One word could protect confidence. Another could dismantle it. Across the table, one of the senior partners leaned forward, elbows resting lightly against polished wood, eyes fixed now not on Adrian, but on Naomi. And what would you adjust it to, he asked. The question landed clean, direct, and with it came the final shift. Because they were no longer questioning if she was right. They were asking how far her understanding went. Naomi did not rush her answer. She did not reach for the tablet. She did not need to. If the compliance delay pushes rollout into the next fiscal window, you lose early adoption advantage, she said, her tone steady, almost instructional, but never overreaching. That reduces your initial return curve by at least 12%. Possibly more if competitors move faster. Silence again. But now it was deeper. Heavier. Not uncertain. Not shocked. Just absorbing. Adrian exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to mark the moment. He had built his reputation on being the sharpest mind in any room he entered. The one who saw what others missed. The one who moved first, fastest, and most accurately. And yet tonight, the clearest red had not come from him. It had come from someone he had not even considered worth hearing. He shifted slightly in his chair, posture no longer angled forward in dominance, but centered, balanced. Listening. Really listening. And if we adjust? He asked, quieter now, not as a challenge, but as a continuation. Naomi met his gaze again, unwavering. Then you control expectations before they control you, she said. Simple. Direct. Strategic. The kind of answer that did not just identify a problem, but preserved authority. That was the second realization. She was not trying to embarrass him. She was protecting the deal. Protecting the room. Protecting him. That was not something arrogance knew how to process easily. Around them, the investors exchanged glances, subtle nods passing between them, not dramatic, but decisive. Respect had entered the room. Not loudly, not ceremonially, but undeniably. Adrian let the silence sit for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. Not to the room, not to the partners, to her. And that was the third shift. Because acknowledgement, from a man like him, was never given lightly, and never without consequence. The deal was no longer what it had been when the night began. Neither was the balance of power. And for the first time since he walked into that room, Adrian Cole understood something he had never needed to before. The most valuable voice in the room is not always the one at the head of the table. No one rushed to fill the silence, because now the silence had value. It was no longer empty space between conversations. It was where decisions were being made. One of the senior investors slowly set his pen down, not in hesitation, but in recalibration. "We should pause execution until the revisions are clear," he said, his tone calm, but firm enough to carry weight. Another nodded immediately. Agreed. Accuracy over speed. The words landed like a quiet verdict. Hours earlier, that same room had been ready to move fast, to sign, to celebrate. Now, speed felt reckless. And everyone knew why. Adrian leaned back slightly, not retreating, but reassessing, his gaze moving from the tablet to the partners, and then back to Naomi. He could feel it now, the shift in gravity. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just precise. The room was no longer orbiting him alone. It had widened. And at the center of that widening space stood someone he had nearly dismissed without a second thought. He studied her again, more carefully this time, not searching for flaws, but for understanding. "You caught both," he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for the table to hear. Naomi did not respond immediately. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She simply held her ground, her presence steady, her expression unchanged. Because this was not a performance. It was not a moment she had been waiting for. It was just the result of paying attention when others did not. One of the partners shifted in his seat, curiosity now replacing skepticism. "What is your background?" he asked, not casually, but with genuine interest. Naomi glanced at him briefly, then back at Adrian, as if recognizing that the question was not really about her history, but about how someone in her position could see what others missed. "I work here," she said simply. A few quiet smiles flickered around the table, not mocking, but acknowledging the understatement. Because now everyone in that room understood that her job title did not define her capability. Adrian exhaled slowly, a subtle release of something he had not realized he was holding. Control had not been taken from him. It had been challenged. And more importantly, it had been improved. That was the part he could respect. He reached for the tablet again, but this time not to dominate the conversation, but to engage with it differently. "We revise the clause, adjust the timeline, and update projections before we move forward," he said, his voice clear, grounded, no longer performing certainty, but building it. Heads nodded around the table. Agreement, real this time. Not just because it was his plan, but because it was the right one. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the first small movement she had made since speaking, preparing to step away, to return to the role everyone originally assigned to her. But before she could turn, Adrian spoke again. "Wait." The word landed differently now. Not dismissive, not commanding, just intentional. She paused, looked at him, and in that brief moment, the entire room watched, not because of power, but because of respect. Adrian held her gaze, something quieter in his expression now, something closer to recognition than authority. "You did not just fix a mistake," he said, measured, deliberate. "You changed the outcome." No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Just understanding. Because in rooms like this, the highest form of acknowledgement is not noise. It is attention. And for the first time that night, Naomi Brooks had all of it. The room did not erupt, and that was what made it real. No applause. No exaggerated reactions. Just a quiet, collective shift in how everyone was sitting, how everyone was thinking, how everyone was looking at her. Respect, in spaces like this, did not arrive loudly. It settled. Adrian held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, not out of obligation, but acknowledgement. "Stay," he said, his voice calm, stripped of the earlier edge. It was not a command this time. It was an invitation. Naomi paused, just enough to consider it. Around them, the partners were already reopening their notes, adjusting numbers, speaking in lower tones now, more precise, more careful. The deal was not collapsing. It was evolving. And every adjustment they made traced back to a voice that had not been part of the plan. One of the investors turned slightly toward Naomi. If we restructure the rollout to align with the delayed compliance, do you still see the same risk on early adoption? He asked, his tone direct, but respectful. Naomi shifted her weight, the tray still balanced, but no longer a barrier between her and the conversation. Not the same, she answered, her voice steady. But you will need to account for competitor response in that gap. If they move first, you lose positioning, not just timing. Heads nodded, not because they were agreeing out of politeness, but because they understood. Adrian watched it all, the way the room was responding, the way her words were integrating into decisions without resistance. That was the part that mattered. Not that she had spoken, but that what she said held under pressure. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table now, no longer separating himself from the conversation, but participating in it differently. Then we control the narrative before they do, he said, building on her point, his tone aligned, not dominant. Naomi met his gaze again, a brief exchange, silent but clear. Agreement, not submission. That distinction mattered. Minutes passed, but they felt different now. Slower, more intentional. The energy in the room had shifted from performance to precision. Every number questioned, every assumption tested. And through it all, Naomi remained steady, speaking only when necessary, never overextending, never trying to prove more than what was already evident. That restraint carried weight. It made every word count. One of the partners leaned back, studying her with quiet curiosity. You realize most people in this room would have signed that without a second thought, he said. Naomi's expression did not change. Most people in this room were not expected to notice, she replied softly. A few exchanged glances at that. Not uncomfortable, just aware. Adrian exhaled, a faint shift in his posture, something almost reflective passing through his expression. Because the truth was not difficult to understand. It was difficult to admit. He had not just overlooked a detail. He had overlooked a person, and that cost had almost been measurable in millions. He reached for his glass, paused, then set it back down without drinking, as if even that small habit no longer fit the moment. We move forward, he said finally, his voice steady, grounded in something new. But we do it right. No one disagreed. The deal would continue. Stronger now. Cleaner. But the room would not forget how close it came to going wrong. And more importantly, who made sure it did not. Naomi shifted slightly, preparing to step back, to return to the quiet rhythm she had carried all night. But the space around her had already changed. She was no longer part of the background. And everyone in that room knew it. The meeting did not end with signatures. It ended with clarity. Papers were not pushed forward in haste. Pens were not lifted in celebration. Instead, the tablet remained on the table, open, revised, questioned, understood. One by one, the investors leaned back, not in disengagement, but in agreement that the deal, now corrected, was worth more than the version they almost rushed into. Adrian sat still for a moment after the final adjustment was confirmed, his eyes resting not on the numbers, not on the skyline, but on Naomi. The room began to shift back into motion around them, quiet conversations restarting, chairs adjusting, glasses finally lifted again, but something fundamental had changed. Not just in the deal. In him. He stood slowly, not to dominate the space, but to step into it differently, his presence no longer pressing down on the room, but aligning with it. Naomi had already taken a step back, instinct guiding her toward the role she had always played, the one that required her to disappear once her task was done. But this time, that role no longer fit the room she was standing in. Naomi, Adrian said, her name deliberate, clear, spoken without hesitation. It was the first time he had used it. She stopped, turned, met his eyes. The room noticed. Of course it did. Because names matter in places like this. They define who is seen, who is recognized, who belongs. Adrian held her gaze, not searching now, not questioning, just present. You changed more than the numbers. Tonight, he said, his voice steady, stripped of ego, anchored in something far more difficult to express. You changed how this room thinks. Silence followed, but it was not the same silence from before. This one was full, affirming, true. Naomi did not smile widely, did not step forward to accept anything, did not shift into a different version of herself to match the moment. She simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement, grounded and complete. Because she had not spoken to be recognized. She had spoken because it was necessary. Adrian glanced briefly at the partners, then back at her. If you ever decide you want to do more than serve in rooms like this, he added, measured, careful, you would not be starting from the bottom. It was not a dramatic offer, not a transaction, just a door, opened with respect instead of assumption. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then responded in the same tone she had carried all night. Calm, clear, unmoved by status, but aware of value. I already do more, she said quietly. No challenge, no arrogance, just truth. A few subtle smiles appeared around the table. Not amused, impressed, because that answer did not reject the opportunity. It reframed it. Adrian nodded once, accepting it, understanding more in that moment than he had at the beginning of the night. Naomi turned then, finally stepping away, moving through the room with the same quiet precision she had carried from the start. But now, no one saw her as part of the background. They watched, not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned it without asking. Adrian remained where he was for a second longer, looking at the space she had just left, then back at the contract, then out at the city beyond the glass. The skyline had not changed. The numbers had not changed dramatically. The room itself looked the same, but something essential had shifted. He had walked in believing he owned the room. He left understanding something far more valuable. Power can control a conversation, but only awareness can change its outcome. And that night, the most powerful voice had been the one no one thought to hear.